Welcome to What is Going On for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandy Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello. In 1954, Aldous Huxley's influential book, The Doors of Perception, was published. Huxley's title is taken from William Blake's 1793 book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in which Blake observed, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. As a listener to this show, I'm certain that, like me, you've often asked yourself, what really lies beyond the doors of our perception? Anthony Peake is the author of 10 books, all of which have one central theme. What exactly is consciousness? And what is its relationship with the seemingly solid material universe presented to us by our senses? A member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Scientific and Medical Network, and the Society for Psychic Research, Anthony Peake joins us tonight to discuss his new book, Opening the Doors of Perception, The Key to Cosmic Awareness, in which he updates Aldous Huxley's work and offers some astonishing correlations between the experiences of altered states of consciousness, telepathy, precognition, near-death, and out-of-body experiences, and the experiences of people with neurological disorders such as autism, migraine, frontal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's disease. Anthony Peake, welcome.
Great to talk to you, Sandy.
So, Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception was published in 1954, which is the same year that you were born. Given your interest in consciousness and perception, does that not strike you as somewhat interesting?
Well, probably. In fact, I was born on April the 12th, 1954, and on April the 11th, 1954, that is well known for being the most boring day that ever happened. And on April the 12th, 1954, that was the day that rocked the world because Rock Around the Clock was recorded. So there you go. That's how coincidences happen. And, of course, me.
And you. So what first sparked your interest in perception and consciousness?
It's something I've always been fascinated in ever since I was a child. It's something that has always intrigued me as to what am I? I'm some kind of consciousness. I'm some kind of point of awareness that's experiencing a universe outside. And when I was 12 years of age, I had double pneumonia. And during the crisis of double pneumonia, I experienced a series of very, very powerful hallucinations that fascinated me because clearly these were things that were not in the real world, but my brain was creating them and placing them in the external world around me. And from then on, I've continued to understand exactly what is taking place when we believe ourselves to be conscious and exactly just what is going on. And I suppose these are the huge questions. And I took the opportunity when I was at university to study sociology, and I did the sociology of language, the sociology of religion, and continued throughout my career as in management in the UK, being interested in these subjects. So it's something that I've always wanted to do, and fortunately there are publishers that want to publish my books.
Why did you decide to call this book Opening the Doors of Perception?
Well, I'd read The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell many, many years ago, and Aldous Huxley had always fascinated me as a writer. And of course, my initial exposure to Huxley's work, or The Doors of Perception, was through the band The Doors. And I was quite intrigued many, many years ago when I first discovered The Doors and Jim Morrison as to why they called themselves The Doors. And I read up and it said that the reason was that Jim Morrison had read The Doors of Perception. So I took myself off and I read it. And it fascinated me. But I felt that the problem that Huxley had, well, not the problem, it wasn't anything to do with him as such, but in 1954, our knowledge of particularly neurology and neurochemistry wasn't particularly extensive. Similarly, our knowledge of mind-altering substances, mind-altering drugs, hallucinogenic substances, and everything else were fairly restricted. And I felt that there was an opportunity here to update what Huxley had written in 1954, taking into account our modern understanding of how the brain works, our modern understanding of quantum physics, our modern understanding of cosmology, and just our modern philosophy as well. So I thought this is the perfect opportunity to do so.
So after his experiences with mescaline, Huxley wrote that each one of us is potentially mind at large, that insofar as we are animals, our business is at all costs to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which will help us to stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. A theory that you say does not conform with the general view. By general view, do you mean, the average person? What they believe about consciousness?
Well, the general view is that it's actually called naive realism. And the general view is, and the general belief is, quite logical really, that the external world that is presented to you by your senses is that external world. In other words, the brain creates an inward facsimile of external reality as it really is. Now, modern-day scientists and modern-day researchers in consciousness studies actually call this naive realism, because this is not what is taking place at all. We have no real knowledge of what the external world really looks like, because nobody really knows what it really looks like, because, of course, everything you see is a very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, light, for want of a better term. And we believe that that is what is real. For instance, there are things called qualia, like, for instance, the color red. The color red doesn't exist outside of the perceiver of the color red. And indeed, you and I we can both agree that a certain shade is a color red, but we don't know whether we are sharing the same perception of red. Because, of course, all red is a particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum and a particular wavelength of electromagnetic energy that when it stimulates the retina in the eye and effectively, ultimately, the visual cortex in the brain, it creates an image of this color red. But red doesn't exist anywhere. So the idea is, and what very much Huxley was saying, and what many philosophers have said, I mean, Huxley wasn't original here. I mean, C.D. Broad, the philosopher, was the guy that discussed this in great detail, and also, of course, Henri Bergson, the great French philosopher, and indeed William Blake himself. And the belief is that we cannot perceive everything that's really out there, because if we did, we'd be simply overpowered by the sensory overload that we would perceive. So in order for us to survive in this world, for instance, if you've got a saber-toothed tiger standing in front of you and about to attack you, you have to focus your attention on escaping that saber-toothed tiger. If you were hearing every single rustle in the grass and you were perceiving all the other things, it would get in the way of your survival. I use the analogy of the fridge. You know, you're sitting there in your kitchen reading a book, and the fridge goes off, and you suddenly notice the absence of the sound of the fridge. But the sound of the fridge has been there all the time, but your brain has cut it out because that's what we do. And it's self-evident from neurological information and from perception studies that that's what the brain does all the time. It cuts information out. We perceive a very, very small part of what is really out there. In the book, you may remember, I think it's in this book, it might have been in my earlier book, The Infinite Minefield, where I use the analogy of what I call sort of electromagnetic chauvinism. And by this, I mean that we believe that the world we see is the real world, and it's the way the world really is. But of course, to a bat, the world looks completely different. And to other animals, for instance, a bumblebee sees light in the infrared. So a rose looks completely different to a bumblebee than it would do to a human being. Dogs hear more sounds than we do. And in fact, in terms of the light, the whole electromagnetic spectrum, if it was the length of the Mississippi River, the world we see, the visual light we would see, would be around about an inch, about 18 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. But we believe that everything that is out there is what is perceived by the eyes, and it isn't.
In your book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, you introduce the idea that human consciousness is split into two independent foci of self-aware consciousnesses, which you call the daemon and the eidolon.
Eidolon, yeah.
Eidolon. Tell us more about that.
Okay. This is, initially, it's a system of belief that goes back millennia, and also it's found in most societies around the world. And the idea is that we are two people, not one, and that within ourselves is another being that is us. In fact, it's the universal self. And this being is far more intelligent and far more knowing than we are. And that this being, in times of stress, in times of danger, in times of creativity, can manifest itself within the consciousness of the everyday self, the eidolon. I call this being the daemon because this is what the ancient Greeks called it. For instance, Socrates, the philosopher, claimed that all through his life he had a daemon that was with him. And this daemon spoke to him and warned him about things, used to even guide him as to what the weather was going to be like the next day. And all through the centuries, people have...
We'll just break there for a few moments, Anthony. You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and I'm speaking with author Anthony Peake about consciousness, what it is, where it resides, and what really lies beyond the doors of perception. We'll be back in a few moments.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Change and growth are part of natural life and also part of your spiritual life. Everyone needs support and guidance, especially during life passages. Upgrade yourself with the OMTimes Experts program. With OMTimes Experts, you have access to the best intuitive coaches, spiritual teachers, counselors, astrologists, and oracles. Our team was carefully selected so you can trust. Find out more at experts.omtimes.com.
My name is Meera Batra, and this is How I Live United. Many families have come to America for a better life. I advocate for these families with United Way. United Way empowers them to see opportunities available. We help them get involved with their kids' schools and network within the community. My name is Meera Batra. I help families see opportunity and succeed. I don't just wear the shirt, I live it.
Give, advocate, volunteer, Live United. Go to liveunited.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. Anthony Peake, before the break, you were telling us about the daemon and the eidolon. Would you say that the daemon is what many children think of as an imaginary friend and grown-ups think of as their higher self or a guardian angel?
Very much so, very much so. I also argue that the daemon is that voice in your head that warns you about things. And it's also within the descriptions of the near-death experience. It is the being of light that people encounter, and also spiritualist people and mediums have spirit guides. Other people will call them their angels. Some people will call them their guardian angels. But effectively, it's the same thing. Now, unlike a lot of writers in this area, I do the neurology. So whenever I describe something in my books, I very much support it with what I believe is fairly strong evidence from science. So, for instance, in terms of my daemon eidolon idea, I argue this is to do with the way in which the brain is compartmentalized, the way in which we have a right and left hemisphere, and the way consciousness seems to be in both. And there's great evidence from this, from neurology, from hypnotism and everywhere else. So the evidence is there. I think it's just a question of interpretation as to what we mean when, say, somebody has multiple personality syndrome or dissociative personality syndrome. These all involve the manifestation of other entities within ourselves. And of course, we have things like alien hand syndrome, where people, after they've had a stroke, the communication channels between the right and left hemisphere are broken, and somebody's hand, their left hand usually, will have completely different motivations to their right hand. And then finally, we have evidence from the split brain operations that took place in the 1950s and 1960s with surgeons such as Roger Sperry, who actually won the Nobel Prize for his work on split brain patients, and people like Michael Gazzaniga.
So I have to ask you this question, which may seem a little bit odd, but I remember reading years ago about the fact that women have more neural pathways between the left and right hemisphere than men do. And this is why women are very good at, subtle nuances and reading others and, juggling and multitasking. Have you got any evidence at all whether women have more experiences with the daemon than men do?
Generally, yes. I mean, this is something that has intrigued me for a long time. I mean, I work with mediums a lot over in the UK here. And in fact, I interview them and talk to them and actually witness some of the work they do. And it does seem that women's doors of perception, I think, are just slightly more open than the male doors of perception. I think this is because the masculine brain, in many, many ways, is far more based in reality, for want of a better term, whereas women are more imaginative and, as you say, are far more intuitive, which means that the daemon finds it easier to communicate. Now, that's something I haven't actually written about in my book, so I think you picked on something there. And funnily enough, one of the discussions that we've had over the years with myself and my writing group, my groups of readers around the world, is that we believe, or we are concluding, that for most people, the daemon will be the opposite sex. So a male will normally have a female daemon and vice versa. And I think this is fascinating and intriguing. And of course, this is the central theme of Philip Pullman's book, his Dark Materials.
Yes, I was going to mention that. Yes, absolutely. I was fascinated when I read that series. You believe that there's a spectrum of perception that runs from 100% eidolonic to 100% daemonic, and that all conscious beings sit at one point or another along this continuum. Presumably we can move along it.
Yeah, I think we do. I think the whole central point of opening the doors of perception, and the reason I used the term opening the doors of perception, was that for most of us, the doors of perception are probably closed. But for some of us, the doors of perception become slightly ajar. And depending on how, using the analogy of doors, how wide open the doors are, is how much the daemon can communicate with the eidolon. Or in fact, an eidolon can sense the demonic consciousness. And in the book, I cite various examples of what I call the Huxleyan spectrum, which is a spectrum of individuals who the doors of perception become wider and wider and wider till you get the point where they're blown off effectively with people with schizophrenia.
So tell us about, this spectrum. You talk about how the doors are prized open by certain neurological processes, starting with migraine and then progressing through various altered states, such as temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar, autism, and then finally schizophrenia, which you just mentioned.
Yeah, and there's in the book I present strong neurological evidence for this. So again, it's not something that I'm making up, or I think this sounds like a good idea, so therefore I'll write a book about it. I mean, this is based upon known neurological constructs. And I think towards the end of the book, I draw the conclusion that I think it is something to do indirectly. Whereas I used to argue that the daemon and the eidolon are the different hemispheres of the brain, I'm now coming to the conclusion it's far more subtle than that. I think that the eidolonic consciousness exists in the neuronal brain, the brain of the neurons, the brain cells, and the demonic consciousness exists in what's called the glial cells in the brain. Now, the glial cells, you hear the story and people say we only use, 15% of our brain. What they really mean by that is that only 15% of the brain is neurons. The rest of the brain are these things called glial cells. Now, neurologists up until recent years really didn't know what the glial cells were for. In fact, anybody who knows German will know that the word glial actually means glue, because what they believed is that the glial cells held the neurons into position. Now, we know that neurons communicate by using things called neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that are given off between the synaptic gaps between the neurons of the brain. But recent discoveries have shown that the glial network, the glial cells, communicate what is known as non-locally. This is to do with quantum physics, but it is the idea that they can communicate instantaneously across the brain, whereas signals sent by the neurons take time, whereas the glial cells can communicate much quicker. And I argue that this then facilitates the demonic consciousness to be able to access what many people out there would call the Akashic field or the Akashic record. I call it, well, that's not what I call it, but it's what I interpret it as the 0 point field. And in fact, 4 years ago, I wrote a book with Professor Irvin Laszlo on this very subject. And the idea that we can draw information up from 0 point energy, which gets quite complex, but effectively it's a source of information. Now, I therefore believe that it's a neurochemical thing, and it's to do with glial networks. So when somebody has an out-of-the-body experience, or when they have an NDE, or when they hallucinate, what is happening is the doors of perception are opening, and certain neurological substances in the brain are being released to facilitate that communication. And one of the substances, I believe, that's released that does this is something called dimethyltryptamine, DMT.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've come across DMT at all?
I've certainly read about it, yes.
Okay. DMT is one of the most powerful hallucinogenic substances known to man. It's found in plants. It's found everywhere. And it's actually being found in the blood, and it's in the cerebral, spinal cerebral fluid and everything else. But it's never been discovered in the brain until about 4 years ago, when a researcher called Jimo Borgigin at the University of Michigan discovered that inside the pineal gland of live rats, she found DMT. Now, this could be that DMT was either being synthesized by the pineal gland or was being created by the pineal gland. Now, this is of huge significance, because effectively this means that we have evolved to actually create our own hallucinogenic substance in the brain. Now, Rick Strassman, one of the major researchers on DMT, who in the early 1990s was given a grant by the American government to do research into DMT, he believes that DMT is our reality modulator. Now, they have found there are certain receptor sites in the brain called the TARS receptors, the trace amine associated receptors, and these are like locks to a key, and they work with dimethyltryptamine. So it means dimethyltryptamine is probably a neurotransmitter. And I think this is what facilitates, the more dimethyltryptamine in the brain, the more it facilitates the doors of perception to be opened and allows us to perceive alternate realities, to move in alternate universes within our own brains, as it were, if that makes sense.
So is there what's actually going on? If this is progressive, like you've got migraine and then temporal lobe epilepsy and so on, what is happening there? Is it an influx of more chemicals that's making the difference and progressing someone through it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, and I'm talking to neurologists at the moment. Quite a few neurologists are quite intrigued by the position I'm taking on this. And there must be ways that we can test this, just to see whether it is the case that either the dimethyltryptamine in the brain, there's more dimethyltryptamine in the brain of somebody who is progressing along the Huxleyan spectrum. So in other words, somebody who has migraine has a smaller amount of dimethyltryptamine, and then somebody, when they go into temporal lobe epilepsy and bipolar, they have more. Then when they get into schizophrenia, even more. And of course, as we discussed earlier off mic, the idea of Alzheimer's disease and autism. And I feel that there is some neurochemical basis to this. And it must be to do with the chemicals. And the chemicals are allowing us and they're facilitating us to go to other places. Because people who take ayahuasca, people who take hallucinogenic substances and hallucinogens, which are technically known as entheogens, which technically, the word entheogen, which is the technical term for these things, actually means finding the God within. So that is the term from entheogen. It's finding God. And I believe that there's very, very strong evidence that this is the case, yes.
Well, one of the books on DMT, wasn't the subtitle The Spirit Molecule?
It certainly was. That was Rick Strassman. That was exactly the subtitle. Yeah.
Yeah, I read that several years ago.
Excellent.
So, yes, it is. There are a number of things that seem to be experiences that seem to be common with different levels of access, shall we term it that way. Like some people, I mean, all the way up to voices that you get with schizophrenia. What is creating those different experiences?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question. And I think what is taking place is that, as I intimated earlier, that whatever it is that's causing the doors of perception to be opened, and I argue it's dimethyltryptamine, is that it allows the brain to access a far broader area of information, the area of information that normally a normal closed-down individual doesn't perceive. And this could be information from the past, the present, the future. It could be information whereby other entities, sentient entities, may be able to communicate to us. Because Terence McKenna, one of the major guys that did work on DMT and ayahuasca, actually called them the beings the machine elves, because I think there's a direct link here between alien abductions and people having alien encounters and the voices in the head. You know, sometimes, for instance, I'll cite an example of this. Rudyard Kipling, the British writer, had a being that would come to him and would tell him the stories, his short stories and his novels, and it would tell him what to write. And he called this being the daemon. Now, what is intriguing about Kipling's daemon, and I write about this in the book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, is this being was precognitive. For instance, he once wrote a short story, or a story called The Old Men of Pevensey. And in it, he placed two of his characters inside a tower in Pevensey Castle in Kent, or East Sussex, I think it is, during the Norman invasions. And they're trapped in this town. They can't get out. So the daemon says to him, I'll tell you what, make out that they discover a sea well in the wall and they escape through the sea well. 10 years later, excavations took place at Pevensey Castle and they discovered the sea wall in the tower that he based the novel. Incredible.
And there's so many stories in the book like that. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer and I'm speaking with author Anthony Peake about consciousness and what really lies beyond the doors of perception. We'll be back with more after the break.
The cutting edge of conscious radio, OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
I'm Fidel Nshambo. I was born in a city called the Bukavu in the Congo. We were a loving family, and then, boom, everything that I had disappeared in a single day. People think that when you are a refugee, and they resettle you to America, and all your problems are done. They don't understand that that's the beginning of everything. I was not born a refugee. I was made one.
It's time we welcome refugee families with open arms. Learn more at embracerefugees.org, brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back. Anthony Peake. Your book has kept me awake for several nights running. There's just so much to talk about, and we're not going to be able to cover even a fraction of it. So let's talk about autism and the doors of perception, because this particularly fascinates me. We've seen the instance of autism rise dramatically over the last 10, 15 years, and I mean dramatically. And the whole spectrum. My grandson is diagnosed with Asperger's, and he certainly has many of the sensitivities and interesting phenomena that you talk about in your book, some of which, had me going, oh, so that explains why he used to say the world's spinning and it's going too fast for me. That's why he does this and says that. So I think that there are many people today who are very curious to know what is going on with autism.
Well, it's interesting you talking here about your grandson, really, because the world spinning and the hyper-perceptions they have is actually known as the intense world syndrome. And it was first put together by Henry and Camilla Markham when their own son was going through this. They're both neurologists, I think. And what seems to be happening is that with autism, the doors of perception are very open, but it's very much a sensual thing in the sense that sounds and light and noise are much more intense for them. It's as if the whole world is just brighter and sharper in many, many ways. And it's a kind of a sensory overload that they have to deal with. But on top of this, there is also some fascinating neurological evidence been coming forward, because within the brain there are things called mini columns. These are vertical columns of glutamatergic acid within the brain, and there seems to be a direct link. And again, glutamate and glutamatergic acid is something again that I've discussed in my books for forever. So clearly, what is happening here is that they're seeing the world in a different way, but it's odder than that. Because I spent a year working at a school for children who had autism, or a college for children that had autism, and I used to interview a lot of the people that worked there. The psychologists, the teachers, and everything else, and they regularly witnessed amazing events. Precognition. They witnessed the children's ability to sense things that were not around them, the ability to know time, what time it was, even when there were no clocks. The ability, we know this thing about savant syndrome. Some of them could calculate the most amazing things really quickly. Some of them could tell you your birth date, what day you were born, by just telling you the birth date. We know that it's as if their brain is working in a completely different way. It's as if it's communicating instantaneously. And again, I think it's to do with the glial network. Now, this savant syndrome, which is linked to autism, to me suggests that we need to be listening far more to our autistic children and our Asperger's children, because they are perceiving a world that we can't perceive. But it doesn't mean it's not real. For instance, you may not be aware of this, and it's somebody you really need to get on the show. There is a lady researcher called Diane Hennessy Powell, and she's doing work with a young Indian girl who's telepathic. She is completely autistic. She communicates by using a keyboard because she's nonverbal. But this child is proven to be telepathic. This is not, she occasionally does things. She does it all the time in laboratory conditions. Now, this tells us something profound. And it seems that the consciousness of an autistic person seems to spread out further than the body. They seem to be aware of things that are outside their normal physical body in the sense of thoughts and ideas. They can pick up other people's ideas. Now, this tells us that consciousness then is not embodied in the body, but is a field that surrounds us. And there is a consciousness field that we all attune into. So I think the future of my research definitely is to be looking more into autism and Alzheimer's.
Well, thank you, first of all, for saying that we need to pay attention to these kids, because I'm one of the people who's been saying that for a long time. And I think the work that Diane is doing sounds fascinating. I'd love to have her on the show. I've had many interviews with a lady called Susie Miller, who has been working with autistic kids since 1999 and can communicate telepathically. And one of the astonishing things that she told me, amongst the many astonishing things, is she was working with a child once. The mother was worried because the child wasn't eating. He would only eat the same thing over and over again, and she felt that it really wasn't getting enough nutrition. And while they were talking, the kid shows up telepathically in Susie's field and starts showing her what he's doing. And he was showing her that he can eat this piece of food that he was so fond of, and he could literally transform the molecules in his body into something that was nourishing for him.
Wow.
So, yes, we do need to listen to these children. Absolutely, we do.
Well, this is the problem I have with modern science. I mean, modern science has given us some wonderful things, and I'm not saying that modern science isn't wonderful, but it sometimes restricts itself into the materialist reductionist worldview, and it can't accommodate consciousness. It can't accommodate psi. It can't accommodate ESP, telepathy, precognition. But these are things that people experience all the time. And people on my spectrum experience them even more. So these are our like the equivalent of our astronauts. You know, these are people going into inner space. And these are people exploring inner space. We need to listen to what they're telling us about the inner space, because this is a place is there for all of us. But it's just we haven't traveled there yet, if that makes sense.
I was fascinated when you were talking about the flicker technique, and you said Nostradamus is claimed to have used a similar technique. He'd close his eyes, look at a light source, flicker his fingers in such a way as to create a dappled light effect. And because what he was trying to do was get instruction from a higher power. I mean, the autistic kids do this all the time. They're flapping, they're spinning, they're flicking, they're doing all kinds of things. And it drives their parents mad because they don't know what they're doing. But now we have a clue.
Well, absolutely. Spinning is something, there's an actual technical term, which I can't remember at the moment, for this movement of moving around. But I've seen children do this again at the school I was working at. The children, you see the children deliberately trying to stimulate seizures, because many of them also had epilepsy of various kinds. And they try to stimulate seizures by actually putting their fingers in front of their eyes to cause a flicker effect. Now, the flicker effect is a known phenomenon. You know, sort of a guy called Brian Geisen worked on it back in the 1950s and 1960s. And we know that if you use flickering light and stroboscopic light in a certain way, you can bring about altered states of consciousness. But with children with autism, they seem to be able to elicit that much easier and much quicker than neurotypicals can. And they actively seek out these altered states of consciousness because they actually enjoy them. You know, one of the most famous quote was not a famous quotation, but I use it in my first book, Is There Life After Death, was by a guy called Émile Goncourt, who was a profound epileptic. He was a French writer. And he turned around and he said that his whole life was a nothing between two epileptic seizures. And of course, Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, who was also epileptic, actually once said in his novel The Idiot, he turned around and he said he would give up the whole of his life for just that feeling he had in the aura state before he went into a temporal lobe seizure. These are areas, they're the liminal areas of consciousness, and these are the areas that psychologists, psychiatrists, and neurologists really need to be focusing in on.
Makes you wonder what is so wonderful about those particular states of being. I mean, what are they accessing that's making it so compelling for them?
Yeah, it's as if they're seeing things that we can only imagine. But, you know, people, when they have near-death experiences, one of the things that one of my associates, Dr. Penny Satori, who's an expert on near-death experience, has recently written a book on the transformative experiences of NDEs. People seem to have, again, that kind of that kind of similar, almost touching the noetic, touching the magic that our senses deprive us of. You know, mystics have talked about it for centuries. It's called the oceanic feeling, the feeling of unity with everything. And I believe, again, individuals on my spectrum seem to touch upon that oceanic feeling, that what the researcher Buck said, you know, was the mystic experiences, because they are wonderful, because you see the world in a different way. And it's something we can only imagine as neurotypicals.
Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you said that you're very interested in Alzheimer's. At the other end of the spectrum, there's a massive increase in people having, you know, developing Alzheimer's. And you give some wonderful information. I was really interested in Pat McCreath's experience. Her daughter Maggie sat with her mother and recorded all the things she said. And there's a lot, and I really urge people to read the book because there's, you know, so rich with information. But one of the things that intrigued me was her mother said to her in moments of some kind of lucidity that we are learning, we're immortal. And I think your question, was it your question or Pat's question, was who's doing the teaching? You know, yes. Who's teaching her that she's immortal? My question is, if we're immortal, why do we need a life to learn how to be immortal?
Well, I think this, in my work over the years, I have a concept called cheating the ferryman. And in this concept, I believe that we don't live this life once. We live it many, many times. And it's a learning experience. It's like Groundhog Day, the movie. And we come back again and again and again to live our lives until we live the perfect life. And we then become, or like an avatar, we move on. And this life is almost like a computer game.
Anthony, we have to go to break now. We'll be back in a few moments with some more exciting information.
Bringing a more conscious lifestyle to your world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Spiritual, metaphysical, green living, psychic, alternative healing, life coaching. Do any of these or similar terms apply to your business or cause? If so, you are in a niche market with a very specific audience. Conscious Gate PR is the world's leading conscious public relations agency. With a global reach of over 4 million and growing, we offer comprehensive media campaigns to our targeted market. Learn more at ConsciousGatesPR.com. Conscious marketing for conscious minds.
Hi everyone, this is Shay Parker, the host of Best of the Best, which airs live right here on IOM Radio every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific. I'm super excited to bring you expert guest hosts, spiritual discussions, free psychic readings, and so much more. I can promise that you will not want to miss this one-of-a-kind, fun, yet touching, down-to-earth show. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific on OTR-FM. This is Shay Parker, and I can't wait to see you there.
If you own a gun, you have a full-time responsibility. When you aren't using it, be sure it can't get into the hands of curious children, troubled teenagers, a thief, or anyone else who might misuse it. Your family, friends, and neighbors are all counting on you. Remember, always, lock it up. For more information on firearms storage safety, visit ncpc.org. This message brought to you by the National Crime Prevention Council, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. Anthony Peake, this is one of those times when I wish I had a 2-hour show, but we don't. We have about, 8 minutes. So I'd like you to finish what you were saying before the break about the computer game analogy, and then I'd really like you to talk about why you deliberately placed the chapters on autism and Alzheimer's back to back at the end of the book.
Okay. the simulation argument is something that has fascinated me for quite a few years now, and there is more and more developing information that this reality that we perceive is in fact a hologram. And again, that sounds like a totally crazy statement to make, and it would be if it wasn't actually backed by very, very powerful science, including very powerful scientists. And it's to do with black holes and to do with the loss of information within black holes. It gets quite technical, but they're actually now discovering more and more evidence that the reality we perceive outside is in fact a simulation. Then the question is, if it is a simulation and it's like a computer program, who's done the programming? And there is, again, an argument that it's ourselves in our own future that have programmed this, and we're existing in what's called an ancestor simulation. So there's some fascinating information which I discuss in great detail in the last chapter of the book, and indeed in various articles I've written in recent months in various books, various magazines and things. But fascinating information, because it means that consciousness is a singularity. It means effectively that what is inside is outside, and vice versa, which is, of course, what the mystics have been teaching for centuries. You know, you read the Vedanta, the Ayurveda Vedanta, you read most of them, the great books of mysticism, and they all say the same thing. We are all one, and we need to look inside ourselves to find God. So that's that thing. The reason I link Alzheimer's and autism is because there are fascinating parallels, and I've watched it with my own mother, because my mother is now catatonic with Alzheimer's. And I was in a queue in a store about 18 months ago, and there was a newborn baby with its mother. And I looked at the newborn baby and the way its eyes were moving and the way it was looking but not focusing, and I immediately recognized that in my own mother. And there is a theory, well, it's more than a theory, it's something that has been looked at a lot of the times, and the idea is that you can parallel the development of a child to the decline of an elderly person. And they seem to run in parallel, in reverse, as if the person is going backwards in time. It's a bit like, you know, The Amazing Life of Benjamin Button. It's as if they run backwards as they get older. Now, this makes great sense to me, because if my cheating the ferryman hypothesis is correct, this is exactly what should be observed. As we get towards the end of this life, we are preparing ourselves for moving back to live the life again. And when we live the life again, our higher self, our daemon, remembers what happened in the last life. And that's how the daemon knows and can warn you, because it's lived your life before. It's almost like it's a computer simulation, and your daemon is the game player, and you are in the game. And of course, in the game, individuals, sprites on the screen when you play a third-person computer game can get killed. But the game player just goes back to the start of the game again and starts again, this time with the knowledge of the danger that killed the on-screen character last time. So it has a degree of logic to it. It's again proving it, you know, and I say one of the major proofs of all this is the most common psychic phenomena in the world, déjà vu. 70% of people will have at least one déjà vu experience in their lives. What is déjà vu? It's the recognition that you have been somewhere before, or you have done something before, or you've met somebody before. The only rational explanation for that, as far as I'm concerned, is that you have lived this life before, and it's a memory breaking through from last time.
Wow. I want to briefly touch on the lucidity that often happens with somebody with Alzheimer's just before death. And when parts of the brain are virtually completely eroded, what is going on there?
That intrigues me, absolutely intrigues me. It happened with my own mother, and this was really weird. The home phoned up one day, and my mother was really kicking off. She was shouting and screaming, and they asked me to speak to her. Now, she had been very distant, and she wasn't really together at all mentally. But the person I spoke to that evening was completely different. And she turned around to me and she said, "Oh, Tony. She said, these people have captured me. They're holding me prisoner." She said, "I was sitting watching television with your father, and I just dropped off to sleep for a second, and I woke up and I'm here." She had gone to sleep watching Morecambe and Wise in 1973 and had suddenly found herself woken up in 2012, 2013 in an old folks' home. And she was terrified. And then she asked me how old I was. And she said, "You're in cahoots with these people. I'm going to sue you as well." And I had to put the phone down. And then when I spoke to her again, she'd gone back into her catatonic state. Now, that again is a classic example of terminal lucidity. This sudden, the old personality comes forward again. And it's reported, I mean, Penny Sartori again has recorded this many times. As people get towards death, or they're terminally ill or whatever, they suddenly see things. They see people who have died. They see various things. The technical term of this is called Peake experiences. And it's been reported again. The Society for Psychical Research have been reporting it for well over 100 years. It's as if because if it is true that consciousness is outside of the brain, and the brain is literally a receiver of consciousness, it is not at all surprising that the consciousness loses its communications, its ability to communicate with the brain. But sometimes the signal strength gets stronger, and for a few seconds or a few minutes, the personality can come back. And I believe this is, again, powerful evidence that the brain is a receiver. And it's rather like the analogy, isn't it, that, that if you didn't know any better, when you listen to an old valve radio, you look out the back expecting to see an orchestra or a newscaster in the back. But, of course, the newscaster's not in the radio. And it's just like we are not in our brains. We are somewhere else outside of time and space, probably in the fifth dimension. But these are our meat machines that we exist within this simulation. These are our suits that we wear to be within this simulation.
That story about your mother is a piece that you didn't add there, which was that her voice to you sounded like she did when you were young. And
Correct.
She said that you couldn't possibly be her son because you were, 50-something, and she was relating to you and remembered you when you were 20. Now, that presupposes that she's in that experience. Where is that experience coming from? Is it a kind of dimensional breakthrough that perhaps in another dimension she's living another life and she is, living that life again and she is that much younger and having that experience?
I think that is possibly the case. In my book, The Labyrinth of Time, I discuss in detail the philosophy, the psychology, and the science of time perception. And, of course, time is something we really don't understand at all. And we know that time is completely subjective. So, therefore, there is no reason why we couldn't be existing in different times in some way. Now, there's something called the long body, the ling saria, which is the idea that we are all ourselves from the moment of our birth to the moment of our death. That is us, viewed from the fifth dimension. Again, in the movie Interstellar, there's a section in the movie in Interstellar called the Tesseract sequence. I don't know if you've seen Interstellar.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you know the Tesseract sequence where he's looking at his daughter in stepped time.
Yeah.
And if you were in the fifth dimension looking into the three dimensions of space and the fourth dimension of time, that's how you'd see the world. So if you're outside of that, you can come in at any point. There's a term called orthogonal time, which is time that runs off each point in normal time. If it's a simulation as well, you could flick backwards and forwards as you can do in a computer game, because that was my mother as she was. I know that was my mother as she was. Now, I'd like to believe that's where she is, and what I experienced was part of her dream, that she'd gone into a dream sequence and she dreamt she was an old lady in an old folks home. That's what I'd like to believe.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we're almost out of time, Anthony. I want to quickly, if you can tell us what you're working on next.
Right. Okay. I've just completed my next book, which is a work on J.B. Priestley, the British playwright. And I'm very much applying my ideas to his work and analyzing his plays and his writings in the light of consciousness, time, Jungian psychology, various other things. And also, because this book has been so successful, my publisher, Watkins, have already commissioned me to write the sequel, which I'm starting on at the moment. I'm also working very closely with Maggie Luttrell, the lady who wrote The Gift of Alzheimer's, which is I can facilitate you getting her as a guest on your show, by the way. She's a fellow Watkins author. And she makes a wonderful interview. She's fascinating, so really think about that. But there's lots of projects I'm involved. I'm linking more and more with scientists around the world. It looks like I'm going to be speaking. I spoke in Australia last year. It looks like I'm going to be speaking in Croatia later this year as well. So there's a lot happening. So if anybody's interested in my work, just look me up. Tons of material on the web. You put Anthony Peake in YouTube, you'll find tons of material. And, of course, my website is anthonypeake.com, so just check it out. And also I'm very active on Facebook as well.
Anthony Peake, come back when you get that sequel out. It's been an absolute delight speaking with you, Anthony.
Okay, thank you, Sandy.
Thank you. Opening the Doors of Perception, The Key to Cosmic Awareness, published by Watkins, available wherever good books are sold. And for more info about Anthony Peake, visit his website, which is his name. Peake is P-E-A-K-E. You've been listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and I hope you'll join me again next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me.